Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Objectivity Demands a First-Handed Foreign Policy. I have to admit, when I typed that into the slide, I stopped and I looked and I said, wow, that's a pretty heavy title I've picked. And I just want to warn you, there is a bit of a presumption in this brief that you know a little bit about objectivist epistemology and ethics. That being said, in those parts, I will introduce them briefly and give you some guides to move in that direction. I also want to let you know, in the field of international relations, we tend not to refer to countries as much, but states. So you're going to hear me say state, and that means country, if I say it, not a subdivision like here in the United States. With that being said, what are we going to do today? My goal is to take a bit of a look at the way we do international relations theory, the way we execute foreign policy, and examine how the lack of objectivity leads to bad theory and bad policy, and then turn to looking at the world objectively and how that leads to what I call a first-handed foreign policy. But why are we here? As Keith said, I spent 24 years in the United States Marine Corps. I was basically an instrument of foreign policy, right? At the pointy end of the spear, as we like to say, it was my job to do what those in Washington thought was necessary in order to make our policy what they wanted it to be. In fact, I started my career as an armor officer, and so it doesn't get a whole lot more concrete than when you're sending a 120 millimeter armor-piercing round downrange, or when you're trying to protect yourself from one. Very few people question objectivity in those situations, right? It has real effect, and we understand that. So things are pretty cut and dry. You drive the tank around, you shoot the tank, you turn the wrench on the tank, it's pretty clear. But I was then fortunate enough to be accepted as a foreign area officer. So it became my job to study China, understand it, understand the way the world works. And I spent a good part of my career in the Western Pacific. And as I worked as a diplomat, a planner, a strategist, advising policymakers and ambassadors, I came to realize that our foreign policy often seemed to miss the boat. We didn't seem to understand the world we were acting in. We were moving around this way and that without a good appreciation for their effects on the real world. And let's face it, the real world kind of matters here. So I retired from the Marine Corps, went back to school, said, I'm going to get a PhD and get smart on this. And what I found is we're a little bit confused from the theory side as well. Okay? We don't seem to really grasp the world that these theories are supposed to be describing. In other words, there's a lot of problems in international relations conceptually. They therefore fail to explain our world. Now, whether you enjoy playing Risk or not, you probably know that that's not the way the world really works. However, if you look at some of our theories, you might think it is. But the interesting thing is, a lot of the theorists actually use philosophy in crafting their theories, right? These are my premises, this is how the world works. And they're using that knowledge to try to actually explain the world. They're trying to be objective. They want to explain how things happen, describe them accurately, and then be able to make some predictions about the future. But they're not succeeding at that, right? So you wonder, what's going on? The practitioners are also confused. Now, from a practitioner point of view, you got to consider, right? We're working in the real world. I'm not doing this, just for the fun of it. I want to be efficacious. I want my policy to be successful. One would at least hope that these guys want their policies to be successful. They also, for better or worse, most of them know there are real consequences if they don't relate their ideas to the real world. Trump may be an exception in this regard. He's a little bit off the reservation. But generally, if you look at the people from president on down in the foreign policy establishment, they're working really hard to try to make their ideas work in the real world. But the theorists, the practitioners are getting it wrong. So what are they doing wrong? Well, leading off our previous speakers today, it has to do with philosophy. Practitioners of foreign affairs need it. Within international relations theorists, they make a couple mistakes that lead us down the wrong road. Now, theorists are trying to build theories. They want to explain how the world works with a few key variables that they can use manipulate. If this variable goes this way, X happens. If it goes that way, Y happens. But in order to do that, they have to abstract from the real world those key things that they think are important. Unfortunately, in doing so, we tend to get billiard balls, right? We get something that looks easy to handle, that we think we can predict, but it may not actually be the actors that matter. Their abstractions tend to leave aside something that's very complex and difficult to model, namely, right, human action and human decision making, because it's all over the place. It's hard to model. So they leave it aside. Unfortunately, that does not leave them a lot of good options. And we often end up with an intrinsic view of things like state interest, right? It's not tied to the actual reality. It's not discovered through a logical exploration of existence. It's just, that's what it is, right? It's like Plato's forms applied to states. They have interest. You just got to know it. And that leads us astray. In response to that, some of them end up reverting back to subjectivism. And you'll see this a lot in both kind of sloppiness and the intrinsic thing isn't really working. Wouldn't it be nice if it worked this way? Oh, it must. To some theories we'll discuss in a minute that are explicitly primacy of consciousness and just ignore what's actually there and think they can make it better. Now, on the security practitioner side, they're not necessarily digging into that same level of theory, but they're from among the populace, and they've absorbed these ideas from their teachers, preachers, parents, and peers. So they accept a flawed metaphysics, right? They often are primacy of consciousness to some extent, whether they think so or not. They tend to miss what's actually out there based on their preconceived notions. They accept flawed epistemology. Knowledge comes from God, or from the guy who taught me, or the guy to my left. They're not actually exploring the world to understand exactly how it's going on. And of course, widespread is the acceptance of altruism in our foreign policy establishment. So from a philosophical perspective, they don't know where they are, they don't know how to know it, and they certainly have issues with what to do. So what are they missing? Well, at root, they're missing objectivity. So I'm probably not the guy to give a course on objectivity. You should get Dr. Peikoff to do that. But real quick, I want to introduce to you kind of the core assumptions here. To act with objectivity, you are volitionally adhering to reality by following a certain rules of method, a method based on facts and appropriate to man's cognition. So I read this, and two things jump out at me real quick, right, which I've underlined. The first relates directly to metaphysics, right? You have to obey reality. As someone who's been out there trying to execute foreign policy, this speaks to me, right? I need to make sure that I'm looking at what is actually out there before I decide what's going on. And a key part of this is who acts. Are there these billiard balls acting out there, or are there real people making real decisions? Also in this vein is the importance of understanding causality. If you haven't taken the time to figure out who acts, you're going to have an issue with causality because, as Rand points out in Peikoff, it's a corollary of identity, right? It's something that actions are something that entities do. And you need to understand that in order to understand what's actually going on out there. You need to take the time, not pulling from some authority or making it up, to query existence, understand exactly what's going on out there, and then you can know what's the foreign policy situation is, then you can make a decision. So what I'm going to try to do here is just pull out 4 ideas based on the discussion of objectivity that we can then use to apply to international relations and foreign policy. The first is the importance of identity. International relations theory tends to misidentify the actual entities out there, which leads to mistake, right? So identity, we need to have the right identity. They tend to do events-based causation, right? Which if events follow events, then there's no real actor. As Yoram pointed out this morning, you don't know who the adversary is, and you don't know what they're going to do. So you need to have a proper understanding of causality. Where they don't, they get in trouble. As I pointed out, they tend to have an intrinsic view of things, especially of interest. States have an interest in security. Why? Well, they just do. Right? If you don't take the time to actually know what the entity is, how you know it, what their interests are, you're going to get in mistakes. And finally is the problem of primacy of consciousness. We'll see that in several cases, both from a theory perspective and foreign policy, how without taking the time to know existence, you go astray. Now, I am a political scientist, so I like case studies. So what we're going to do is we're going to look across the major theories of international relations, say briefly what they are and their errors, and then we'll say how they answer the Cold War, or how they understand it. That'll also give us an idea to see how these ideas influence policymakers, what advice they give. So we'll start with classical realism, which is written by Hans Morgenthau. It's kind of the basis of most international relations theory. I have a picture of the Leviathan up there to symbolize Thomas Hobbes' influence on realism and international relations broadly. He's definitely the intellectual forefather of the way we see the world here, because classical realism begins with 4 key premises, and the first one is anarchy. Right? The world is anarchic. This is not a normative statement, it's descriptive. Hey, there is no higher ruler. So there's anarchy, which means a war of all against all. Second key premise there is groupism. Right? Because of anarchy, man huddles into groups. You notice we're skipping a few steps there, right? But realism basically sees man as forced by these circumstances to come together in groups, huddle together seeking security. Within those groups, they exercise egoism, and by this Morgenthau means they're just out to protect their interests, okay? And then because of anarchy, they're huddled in groups, they have no tool but power to achieve their goals. So anarchy causes men to huddle around in groups and then use power in order to take what they want and seek security. There's several philosophical errors here that you might have noticed. They misidentify man's nature. He's a quivering barbarian in groups, not a rational being with a rational faculty. Non-objective morality in a couple ways here. First of all, Morgenthau kind of, from an intrinsicist perspective, says, well, man seeks security because, right? However, he ultimately says this power versus power is not effective. The only way to solve it is we create a morality where they'll be peaceful. So he dreams up a morality out of nowhere, and well, actually he doesn't even get that far. He just says it's needed and says, bam, that leads to peace, right? So he ends up in a primacy of consciousness in terms of a solution of how we solve the problem of war. And of course, because it's all about events, it's about situations and conditions, it takes an events-based look of causality. If you're trying to figure out foreign policy, you can't identify an actor that you have to influence or think against. So what does this mean for the perspective of the Cold War? Well, if you're a classical realist looking at the Cold War, you're going to say that it happens just because there are groups that fear each other, right? It's the situation. It drives fear, and it forces them to oppose each other. They really don't have a tool except for whim in order to figure out what to do, and it can't actually explain the way the conflict went, the ups and downs, or the conclusion. If you're thinking this way and you're a policymaker, the solution is to build power against power. And then maybe we'll try to build a moral order that stops the power. But that's the only thing you get out of realism as a policymaker. The next major theory is neorealism. You see, Thomas Hobbes is still important. It accepts that premise of anarchy. Excuse me. Neorealism is important because since 1979, when Kenneth Waltz wrote Theory of International Politics, most international relations scholarship is either a refinement of or a response against him. And he has what we call a structural approach. He says, yeah, look, there's these states out there. They exist. They're in anarchy, and they all have some level of capabilities. So you got states, you got capabilities, and then events happen. Because the states are billiard balls, the capability, how much they have, defines whether they're big or small, and they bounce off each other and international relations happen, right? States in this environment seek to maximize security, in other words, make sure their billiard ball is fine, but there's really nothing else that it says that gives us insight into how decisions are actually made for war or peace. From a philosophical perspective, it reifies the state. It's this entity that exists and has an important role in the world, but there's really no effort to define it and say where it comes from. its interests are intrinsic, explicitly so, and if it's just billiard balls bouncing off each other, causality is events-based. If you look at the Cold War then, Waltz says, well, look, it's a bipolar system because you have two big billiard balls, and so they're just going to balance each other and no one's going to go to war. Right? This fails to account for the various shifts during the Cold War of the way these two states went at each other, and it certainly doesn't explain the end of the conflict. It should have continued, according to him. So, from a policy perspective, this led decision makers to focus on relative capability. You see the cover of his book up there. It's two states with equal number of weapons, therefore stability. It also encourages policymakers not to worry about what's going on in other states. All you have to do is look at the size of their military, and policy is decided. Right? If I need more security, bigger military, or more friends. In other words, make my billiard ball bigger, or get a whole bunch of billiard balls together. It really gives the policy decision maker no other information. The third one is liberalism. You'll see our good friend Immanuel Kant pop up there. Liberalism traces back to his ideas, and in terms of policy, Woodrow Wilson, post-World War I. And it's generally broken into three types. Ideational liberalism says, well, if people agree about their ideas, have a general same ideology, they'll cooperate, they won't go to war. Commercial liberalism says if people trade, they'll be interdependent, they won't go to war, they'll cooperate. Republican liberalism comes directly from Kant's theory of perpetual peace, where he said that Republican states won't go to war with other Republican states, and the states next to them will then become Republican, and it goes on and on. They'll cooperate, there won't be war. This today is often known as democratic peace theory, because political science has kind of dropped that term Republican and focused on democracy. And the interesting thing about all three of these is that none of them have stood up to empirical analysis. Right? Lots of research have looked into their assumptions and then traced through history the states that meet them, and none of these conditions actually have led to an avoidance of war. So it doesn't actually hold very well to reality. Other philosophical errors, it's absolutely primacy of consciousness, especially in the ideational and Republican liberalism. These ideas, if we have these ideas, the world will come into being the way we want it to be. And even commercial liberalism is sort of seen through that lens, right? If we perceive interdependence, a word that in and of itself has some unpacking that needs to be done, if we perceive of the interdependence, then we won't go to war. And then additionally, this is all event-based, right? Ideas cause ideas cause ideas. Trade causes cooperation. There's no understanding of who is actually acting and how we know it. So for the Cold War, on the surface, some people think that this theory helps explain the cohesion of alliances, but it doesn't explain disagreements within it. It doesn't explain how they break up, and it certainly doesn't explain the collapse. However, in the policy realm, it encourages our policymakers to focus on things like democracy promotion rather than their own interests. It has also encouraged a statist approach to trade, because if trade with party X is going to lead to not going to war with them, the state now has to get involved and make it happen. So this has been destructive in a few ways. The next theory is neoliberalism, which both Thomas Hobbes and Kant have reared their head here, because it accepts the basic premises of neorealism. It's very structural in that regard, but then they add in institutions help. Because these institutions are out there, if states are in them, that will change their behavior somehow, and there'll be cooperation, right? Shadow of the future, repeated interaction. Now they won't go to war, and things will go well. Problem is, once again, it's just assigning interest intrinsically to states. This is what they are, therefore they must have this interest. And causation is entirely event-based. Even in the institutions, it's not actors, it's the fact that they're in this institution interacting, and cooperation happens. Now, from a Cold War perspective, capabilities should dominate, but those institutions should have mitigated the Cold War. In other words, acting in the United Nations, in the World Trade Organization, should have mitigated the Cold War, when what we actually saw was the Cold War just became battlegrounds for it. It also does not explain how those states acted in the war or how it ended. However, in the policy realm, it encourages diplomats to pursue process for process states, for process's sake, sorry. We can't allow the talks to stop, because if the talks break down, then we won't be talking. Yes, that's true, but what means it? Well, we have to keep talking, because if we keep talking, then goodness happens. What goodness? Well, there's no war. How? Right, blank out. It encourages that process, and you'll see this, real life in the way that diplomats act, and also institutions become ends in themselves, right? Argue for dismantling the UN, and you'll get answers back like, oh, we can't do that. Well, why not? Well, the UN wouldn't be there, right? So, well, that would be the point, right? But because the institution itself is now so important, because it's the agent of cooperation and the agent of no war, we have to support it, okay? But that is not as bad as our last theory, which is constructivism. So Alexander Wentz says, anarchy is what a state makes of it. And what he meant was, anarchy leads to war because we have decided it leads to war. If we could just decide that anarchy did not lead to war, then everything would be good, right? And this happens through an intersubjective consensus. Somehow, all of us in the world come to believe that there will be no war, and then there will be no war. So what we need to do then is epistemic communities, groups of knowledgeable people, need to encourage change of norms to be the right norms, and then everything will be good. Interestingly, the constructivists usually place themselves in those epistemic communities, so they think they know the best way forward. Philosophically, of course, this is straight primacy of consciousness. Identity is completely fungible. Now, in fairness, the constructivists, there is a range from some that we think, well, then we'll act better, to those who like, nope, you think about it, you change existence, right? Full-on primacy of consciousness. Identity is completely fungible. And of course, because there's no actors here, there's nothing but a group will, an intersubjective consensus, it's completely events-based causation. For the Cold War, they would argue that that existed because consensus was, post-World War II, that conflict was inevitable, and therefore it made the threat real. One of their favorite examples is the United Kingdom has nuclear weapons. North Korea has nuclear weapons. The United Kingdom is a friend because the intersubjective consensus we have reached is that they are a friend. North Korea is dangerous with nuclear weapons because our intersubjective consensus has determined that they are dangerous. If we would just change that consensus, they wouldn't be a danger. You can deal with North Korea and see how far that gets you. But from a policy perspective, what this does is it suggests that the real effort that we need to do is change norms. That's kind of the advice to policymakers. So what have we wrought? I summarized here some of the problems that we went through, the way that international relations theory looks at the world. And in the international relations field, we often bemoan the fact that international relations theorists talking in these abstract ways has led to a scholar-practitioner divide. But I think if you look at the ideas we talked about and the advice this ends up giving to policymakers, and you probably saw, you recognize that policymakers are actually following that advice, the truth of the matter is that the policymakers have embraced these same sorts of ideas and they're walking in lockstep. And it has not led to good policy. It certainly hasn't led to good theory. So in order to have better of both, we need an objective approach. The first step in that is recognizing that states are just a human construct, right? They're not something that exists out there independently. They're man-made. They're something we have thought up, a way to organize ourselves in order to be more effective, but the source is in the humans. Consequently, states are led by individuals, right? They're not a billiard ball reacting to the world. There are actual people making decisions about what it should do. And their interests are based on the values those leaders hold and the larger foreign policy establishment. The values come from somewhere, and you need to understand them. In short, ideas matter. And while some states may hold tighter to their founding documents than others, they do represent one of those sources that foreign policy decision makers lean on in terms of, okay, what is important to us and what should we do? And if you you want to understand international relations, you need to see what those important ideas are, because where they intersect, either cooperatively or conflictually, is where international relation happens. Therefore, at the end of the day, it's at the individual level where international politics is caused, by those individuals making decisions, which unfortunately we saw is exactly what the international relations theorists have been abstracting away from, right? We're not looking at individuals, and therefore we're missing the boat. So if we looked at the Cold War from this perspective, we would see that the US and Soviet Russia were driven by opposing philosophies. They made decisions based on this. The leaders used these to evaluate the real world. And I'm not going through the whole Cold War, little quick snippets here on to give you just some idea. So if the Soviets thought the US wanted to destroy us, it would shape the way that they acted, right? If the US thought that the Soviets were expanding aggressively, it would shape the way they responded to it. The key is you need to know what those decision makers, how they view the world, in order to understand the actions they're going to take. At the end of the day, those leaders matter, because their decisions cause state actions. If you think Khrushchev is being risky because he needs to hold on to power in the Politburo, it's going to shape the way you react to him. If you're Khrushchev and you think Kennedy is weak and not going to do something to stop you, then you send missiles on a boat to Cuba, right? How you view that other leader is going to matter. How you view the world is going to matter. Therefore, if we're trying to craft an objective foreign policy, the first step is to recognize the nature of the state, as we said, that it's man-made and the individuals matter there. And then, since we're objectivists and we're applying objectivist ethics here, we must derive from human ethics, and therefore man's nature and his requirements for survival are the appropriate basis for foreign policy. That means we establish a government to protect individual rights, and proactive regulation is wrong. Therefore, states must act to protect its citizens. It's an agent of retaliatory self-defense, even at the international level, not a value maximizer, I like to say, but a threat eliminator. Now, I derive this from an objectivist standpoint, but that word human ethics is important, because I want to understand not just what my best policy is, but I want to be able to understand what others are doing and how they're acting, because it could threaten me. So, while understanding that the nature of that state is going to drive foreign policy, the nature of the adversary's ethics is going to drive what they actually do, right? That's part of knowing who the other person is, knowing who your adversary is, so you can make appropriate action. So then, what is a first-handed foreign policy? So we just said objectivity reveals the actor and the purpose. But what this means is that foreign policy must serve the ends of that state, which, for an objectivist, is the protection of individual rights. Now, I started phrasing it this way several years ago because my audience is generally military, or it was at the time, and foreign policy decision makers, and I'm trying to convince them that you need to come back to the core purposes of the state and our core interest. Our foreign policy has had a tendency to spread out and try to seek other goals beyond those that are appropriate. So while, yes, it should be a moral foreign policy from an objectivist perspective, from that perspective, that moral policy is first-handed, right? It must represent what this state needs and wants, and that's the protection of individual rights. I think part of that is also establishing a system that is supportive of individual freedom. We should be ensuring free trade for our people and free movement, right? But I think just as important is, what does a first-handed foreign policy prohibit? Because this is where we have a lot of problems and why I keep saying first-handed foreign policy. First of all, we should not be promoting international goods. R2P is the responsibility to protect. It's this idea that a state has a responsibility to intervene around the world to stop humanitarian crises among other people. And this was actually explicitly the justification for the intervention in Libya in 2011. They proudly proclaimed in the United Nations Security Council that no interests are at stake here, we're just helping them, right? We're pursuing others' values. The goal is the other. And in doing so, you violate the rights of your own people. So it contradicts the objective role of the state. Another example is countering other states. Now, I'm the first to say that if another state threatens you, you have to respond appropriately. You must eliminate that threat. However, there's been a disturbing trend in U.S. foreign policy, especially in my expertise in China, where we're countering China just to counter China, right? They did X, so we're going to do Y. As soon as you do that, you've ceded control to the other party. You're now pursuing their goods, or more to the point, they're setting the term of the good and you're reacting to it. So you must avoid the inclination to just oppose an adversary to oppose an adversary and figure out exactly what they're doing that is a threat to your interest, not oppose their interest because they're theirs. So that's my idea of what a first-hand foreign policy should be, and hopefully I've given you some idea of why that is objective and how objectivity has led us astray over the years. I think overall our policy and our theory has suffered because of it. The answer is a good philosophy, avoiding intrinsicism and subjectivism, and then focusing on what the actual state requires and where we go from there. So with that, I very happily take your questions. Thank you. The microphone's over here. Yes, Nikos.
Question from a reformed realist. So, realists pay a lot of attention to the idea of geopolitics, the relationship between a geography and the foreign policy of a state. And their arguments make sense empirically. For example, they would say that if the United Kingdom was not an island, it wouldn't have this fleet, for example, and without the fleet, it would be a different country. So the question is, okay. So the question is, do you see geopolitics as something which have value, or do you see it as deterministic? And the follow-up on that is, if we take geopolitics seriously, shouldn't it mean that the United States should keep away from every single conflict outside at least of the continent? Because it has this natural protection, and therefore, any intervention would fall under the categories that you, I think, rightly explained as faulty and unhelpful. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. For those of you who missed the first part of that, it's how geopolitics, this idea that the geography determines appropriate policy or determines the conditions of a state, in some parts of realism is considered very powerful. How accurate is it, and does it lead you to a second-handed foreign policy if you do any intervention? So, two things. First of all, geography is properly a constraint, right? It exists. It is part of the real world, and you have to take that into consideration. However, it's not in terms of what are my interests, what is right for my state to do. It comes in after you've decided that, how do I do it, right? So the fact that the United States is largely an island is often discussed in international relations. Two big oceans on either side, friendly nations to the north and south. It's very advantageous, right? It's fairly secure. It does not have to go abroad very often to defend itself if it does not want to. So therefore, it should not, right? That is the argument. Others would argue, therefore, it can, right? It has the ability, and it must. Offensive realism, another branch of realism, says it must go play in other people's ponds because it's secure back here to ensure that it remains the most powerful. I would argue it should never determine what your interests are, only how you do them. So there is a legitimate reason to go overseas if there is a threat that can threaten you. And let's face it, in the modern era, first air power changed the nature of water, right? And then missiles allow people to strike from far away. So they're very much could be a real threat overseas, that even though the United States is benefited by being more secure because of its geographical location, it could still have to go out and take care of an adversary. So a constraint, I think, is the important thing to remember about geography. About terrain in general, right? It's a constraint. It affects how you do things, not whether or not they're the right things. Jack.
First, I'd like to thank you for speaking loudly and clearly. Not everyone does.
I did that for you, Jack.
Thanks. My question is, did you give the military, who I assume were non-objectivists, the same kind of a speech that you gave us?
So this speech I wrote just for you, right? But no, what I mean in terms of talking to the military is I have very much been an advocate within foreign policy circles that I was in that U.S. interests must, that U.S. policy must be based on our actual interests. It must be first-handed, and then I tell them what those are, right? I say the government only exists for this reason. We should not be doing this because it's beyond the bounds of what our government should do. And then I also explained to them why it would be horribly ineffective, right, such as the Libya intervention. No, but I do take to the military, to foreign policy, my perspective and try to convince them. I find that by saying first-handed, right, which, let's face it, it comes from objectivism. That's where I got it. You know, you don't want to be second-handed. You want to be first-handed. But when I introduce it, it's something that many people who are not familiar with the rest of objectivism can understand. Right? Oh yeah, we should be doing things for our reasons, right? We shouldn't be chasing the tail of the dragon just because the tail is moving, right? So I think I've had a fairly decent reception when I've explained that to people, but plenty of people I haven't reached. So thanks.
Thank
Jack.
you. Thank you very much.
Hi. You mentioned that we want to analyze and understand states' interests in terms of the values and ethics of the leaders. I'm curious, what role do you think the philosophy of their people and also like the constraints of their government, like if they have a separation of powers, like how much does that factor in? Like presumably Trump's philosophy is worse than what his foreign policy reflected because of those factors. How would you think about those?
So good question. I think that that philosophy does matter. That's the first part. Does matter. In fact, my work on People's Republic of China in particular led me to go down that road, right? Because a very different philosophy that suggests a very different ethics, a very different politics, and ultimately international relations guides the leader of that country. As I was working on my dissertation, one of the first things that I thought I was going to have to do was prove that philosophy's residence in the populace at large. Right, I spoke with my advisors, and it was going to be hard in China anyway. But wait a second, it's the leaders that matter, right? The ones making the decision. And so ultimately, it's showing that the ideas are resident among the decision-making class. Now, where do they get that? They get it by growing up in that environment, and that helps give you an idea. But I spend a lot of time digging into the writings and speeches of individual leaders to show that they hold to this philosophy. And then I can use the precepts, the premises of that philosophy in order to show what they do. Now, with the different types of government, that can be important, right? Dictatorships are a lot easier from an analysis point of view, just because the dictator says, right, Xi Jinping is the policy of the People's Republic of China today. For the United States, it's gotten very complicated in recent years. I mean, Trump was all over the place himself. There were parts of his foreign policy that were fairly rational. I happen to know the people who wrote it, and it wasn't Trump, right? Okay, so one benefit of Trump, to be quite honest, in certain areas he was bored with it and didn't pay attention, right? And in some areas we got some decent stuff out because of that. But the United States is a hard case, I think, and actually our adversaries and even our allies sometimes complain about that because we don't understand you. Because we don't know what matters and who matters in this particular case. Now, it should be the president, but he still needs the authority of Congress. The Soviets used to complain, U.S. military, we've read all your doctrine. The problem is you don't follow it. Right? So figuring out where it matters is harder. I think the United States, the revolutionary era, is in time when there's kind of this body of philosophy and all the leaders kind of follow it, easier to apply that to. But absolutely, you need to know what are the key premises that are driving that foreign policy.
Thank you.
What is your opinion on the idea of hybrid warfare, especially the strategy of using the enemy's internal institutions to weaken that enemy? And It's an old idea. I think the destabilization of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that led to the partitions, you know, at about the same time as the French and American Revolution, so it wasn't widely noticed, but we now have both Putin and Xi destabilizing Europe and America by essentially pushing internal anarchy within those societies.
It is a real strategy and real tactics and can be very effective. And as you pointed out, it's as old as warfare. So the one part of that I would take umbrage with is the word hybrid warfare. And the reason I say that is because in the past decade, the U.S. security policy community has tied itself in knots. Do we define it as ambiguous warfare, or hybrid warfare, or gray zone warfare? When the truth of the matter is, it's warfare, as you've pointed out, right? It is a means of attempting to coerce and shape your adversary. And going back to being objective in what actually exists, and I've made this argument to my military colleagues as well, you are hiding what the adversary is doing by arguing over the term. Call it conflict. That's what it is. They are attempting to shape you. And we have this tendency to, the number of books and the reams of paper, of journal articles that have been devoted to how do we name this, have actually got in the way of the U.S. government being able to respond effectively. It's real, it's happening, and it's just warfare. And we need to start understanding that other states look at warfare that way, whereas the United States and some of our Western allies are caught in a post-Westphalian idea. Westphalia, 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, also was the start of the state system that we have today. It said there is war and there is peace and there are two separate zones, right? The rest of the world has been fighting across a spectrum of conflict, and what you described is part of that. Thanks.
Comparing a neoliberalist versus an objective understanding of what's going on in Taiwan and how that should direct our foreign policy, I'm curious what you have to say about that.
Neoliberal?
Yeah.
In terms of what's going on in Taiwan?
Well,
yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I cut you off.
you could say the dominant philosophy of our current government versus an objective policy, and how do we deal with the situation in Taiwan in terms of versus countering China as a whole versus specific strategic interest?
Neoliberalism in particular, I don't think has a whole lot to say about Taiwan in particular, except that it's about capabilities. Taiwan is excluded from international institutions, but we could use international institutions to try to shape the PRC. And we've tried. A huge part of U.S.-China policy since the mid-1990s has been pull the PRC into the international system, pull them into these institutions, and then they will see the path to peace and righteousness, and they'll start behaving just like us. Right? That has been the declared China policy of the United States for a couple of decades. It hasn't worked, right? Instead, they've joined those institutions and ignored them when they didn't fit them, or tried to change them, like the current Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council, which they are stocking with dictators and the like. So neoliberalism doesn't work. So objectively, let me preface this. I'm a huge fan of Taiwan, right? I live there, I support them. But from the United States perspective, you need to look, okay, is Taiwan itself in my interest to defend? I personally would love to defend them. Whether or not the U.S. should spend blood and treasure there is a harder question. I think what you need to do is realize from the U.S. perspective, if the PRC was to take Taiwan, how does that affect me, right? And I think it is bad, but it's not necessarily existential. I think it's something we do not want as the United States. But I think the way we can do that is by strengthening Taiwan so that the PRC can't take them. I'm actually personally fairly bullish on Taiwan. They have terrific terrain for defense. It's a big constraint for the PRC. They have a decent military, not as good as they would like. The problem for the PRC is very, very hard, and I don't think we actually have to go to war to save Taiwan. I think if we continue to support Taiwan in a way that makes it impossible for the PRC to take them, then they'll survive. Part of that is understanding what the PRC is actually doing, right? And if you look at their attempts to shape it, they're afraid to go to war too, for good reason. They're attempting to shape it in other ways, to influence them to go towards the PRC, which frankly demonstrates to some extent the PRC's inability to grasp who the actor is on the other side of the strait. Right? Many people in Beijing still think that if it wasn't for the US and a couple bad politicians in Taiwan, 23 million people would flock back to the mainland. It's not like that anymore. So,
Thank you.
So I do generally agree with your assertion that in foreign policy we should definitely be asserting our interests and defending primarily our interests. However, I was wondering, I've always there's the idea that there's an overarching vision of the world, like free trade will help to prevent war, freedom of movement will help prevent war. I was wondering if you believe there is any sort of overarching vision for the world that we should basically be supporting, and if so, if intervention in other foreign conflicts is ever justified in the interest of supporting those long-term goals.
I think while, if everybody could be objectivist tomorrow, we'd be in good stead. The US government should not be going out and spending my life and my treasure in order to shape other countries in a way that we think would be better for the world. My opinion, right? But based on the idea that to be objective, foreign policy must be based on the government's role. And the government's role is not to do that. It's just to defend against actual threats. So I don't think it should be shaping the world in that regard. I think defending U.S. commerce on the high seas is a valid use of the Navy. It also helps prepare them to defend us. But forcing another state to go along with our vision of the world generally doesn't work, and it's not the proper role of the government. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a wider question on in objectivism. It's usually my impression is that what's significant is the culture, but looking historically, it seems like the political leadership has had an immense influence on the culture, whether it's Washington or Lincoln or FDR or Obama. They have taken a philosophy and influenced by their actions the culture, and Reagan also, for a long period of time. So what is the relationship that you see as far as being significant in influencing the future directions of culture?
Thank you. Philosophy is definitely primary, right? Culture is what, in political science, we like to say is epiphenomenal, which is a fancy word to say it comes out of something else, right? The underlying ideas that form the philosophy are what drive the way that society is going. Culture includes that, but also includes things like what you eat for dinner, right? And so it's not the fundamentals. And so, yeah, the way people think about their lives and about foreign policy is going to matter, but it comes from philosophy through culture. So you're saying, well, you had some leaders who were able to influence the underlying philosophy. Yeah, they're going to have, a stronger effect than culture per se. The two are tightly related because part of culture comes from the ideas of the philosophy, but it's the ideas that matter. The fundamental premises about, going back to the last speaker, right? Where am I? How do I know it? And what should I do lead to how that state's going to act? Thank you. Good question.
Hi. I understood you to be saying that an objective understanding of national interest would lead you to limit the identification of legitimate national interest to just identification of like actual threats to physical security. which makes me wonder about how do you assess whether or not something is really a threat to physical security? You touched on this a little bit in your answer to the earlier question about Taiwan, but I was thinking about arguments, for example, that disparities in industrial capacity constitute a threat to security, and that therefore justifies some sort of industrial policy, not exactly a foreign policy, but I'm wondering how you would assess that kind of argument.
So I reject those arguments on the basis that they come from a misunderstanding of economics, which is based ultimately on flawed philosophy, right? Difference in industrial capacity, and there's a good reason you ask that, is because you read lots of textbooks about how that is a threat, right? You see our governments acting that way. But difference in industrial capacity is an opportunity for trade, right? If states do not harbor ill will and actually want to threaten each other, which, let's face it, is usually for an irrational reason, right? Then differences in industrial capacity is just an opportunity for both states, right? It's like the difference in my capacity and the guy mowing lawns down the street. Yeah, there's an economic difference in what we do and how we do it, but that means there's opportunities for exchange. Right? If people are living rationally, understanding the value of themselves and how they have to survive and how they can gain and maintain their values, differences in industrial capacity are not a problem, and it's not that way between states. There have absolutely been adversarial relationships where there were differences in industrial capacity, and that led some to ascribe the differences and the problems to that, but there's also cases of states with widely different industrial capacities that get along. So I don't think that is an actual threat. It's an opportunity.
Could I ask a brief follow-up?
I actually really want to give other people a chance.
Fair enough.
So, but you can ask me later.
Hi, so I think I want to ask you about, say, doomsday situation. Because as you have mentioned just now, we are already being attacked via disinformation, information warfare by Russia and China. So, like, at what point, because like there's no physical fire because they're utilizing basically our people, they're utilizing Americans. So at what point should DC just come out and be like, hey guys, we are at war with Russia? And the other situation is, say, Asia Pacific, because Japan has gotten a little bit better like these few years, but it has been very pacific. And a lot of its defense reforms weren't exactly done in a democratic way. So like when people actually take notice, things like bad things may start to happen. The same thing with Taiwan. Like it is very hawkish against China, but that may change when, for example, the DPP's domestic policy screws up a little. So at what point should we go, okay, these people do not want help, let's leave.
Okay, thanks. You got several there. Okay. First of all, I would disagree that Taiwan's policy is quote unquote hawkish. That comes with some baggage. They are very carefully trying to thread a line to be themselves, but not cross a line where the PRC feels they have to invade. Have they been more assertive in their autonomy? Yes, but they've been very careful about not crossing a line. And that's because they want to have a voice in international affairs. So the disinformation is a challenge because here they are actively campaigning, and I would agree in several cases that is the case. They are campaigning, but they're not reverting to kinetics. The thing is, disinformation can be deleterious, but in and of itself does not violate anybody's rights, right? Therefore, the answer to disinformation is getting out the truth early and before they start messing with it, and education. Because the importance of understanding the real world goes a long way towards countering disinformation. Getting people to stop and think for a second, how do I know this is true, right? How do I validate this knowledge? is good epistemology, and it goes really far towards fighting disinformation. So I agree other states are using it, and it can be very harmful, but it's not cause to go to war because they haven't actually violated anybody's rights. We should certainly, all of us, promote positive epistemology and good ideas, and that's the best way to counter that. Thank you.
Hi. While I fully agree with your take on objective foreign policy, I am more concerned with whether it is really pragmatically applicable in irrational world. Like, again, Taiwan, for example. Can it not help Taiwan with the reliance on the superconductors, for example?
So in an irrational world, the real danger is to those who are the most irrational, right? Now, understanding what is the rational thing for me to do is the first step. Then I look out at the world and I say, okay, I need to understand who my adversaries are and how they're approaching this problem. And at that point, it's important to say, oh, they're irrational. But irrational how and what will they do? But by approaching the international realm objectively, it allows you to actually take the time and check your facts and understand how they are irrational so you can behave properly. Whereas right now, what tends to happen is, I think the state probably thinks X. Why? Well, states think X, right? I mean, I sat in forums where China experts would say, well, it's obvious that the PRC wants to cooperate with us in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. Okay, why? Well, nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula are bad. Well, to whom? Well, they're destabilizing. To whom, right? Stability is a value. To whom? Right? And so the problem is not that there are other people that are irrational. The problem is that we're not taking the time to understand who they are and if they are irrational, or if they are irrational, how so? Because an important part of understanding the situation is understanding the adversary. But without objectivity, we don't get there.
Thank you.
In the current presidential campaign, which side do you see as pursuing a more objective or first-handed foreign policy against China?
I actually don't like either option. Biden and his foreign policy team, and there are a few bright spots here and there, individuals, right? But they lean very much towards we have a responsibility to the world, and that we should be part of this world system, and that sometimes, sacrificing a little bit of U.S. interests are good for the broader good, and I obviously disagree with that. Trump is scary. He is off the handle. I think during his first term, he went out of the way to just be off the handle and anger people, just to anger people. Now, maybe some of those people needed to be angered. Maybe not. I don't think he knew, right? I think he was just reacting and trying to look tough. There are some of his Asia policy was actually some of the best we've had in a while, but it also wasn't drafted by him. And a lot of the people that did that work for him won't work for him anymore. Matter of fact, after January 6th, there was this rash of resignations of people who had hung on because they thought they could do good, despite the randomness of the president, who will not do it again. And a lot of those people kept things on the rails. And a lot of those people aren't going to do it in the future. So Trump is just so random and irrational, he's frightening. At least you know what you get with Biden, even what's bad. So
Thanks.
Sorry, and it looks like they've stopped the questions, so thank you all very much.